In the winter of 1989, four travelers pulled off a lonely Arizona highway and found the body of a young woman in the desert. She had no identification. No one knew her name. For 33 years, she would be known only as Jane Doe. But when investigators finally discovered who she was, they realized something even more terrifying. The woman had 2 baby daughters. And nobody knew where they were. Somewhere in America, 2 missing sisters had spent their entire lives growing up under different names, while their mother lay unidentified in the desert. It would take nearly 36 years, and a kind of science that did not exist when they vanished, to finally reveal what happened after they disappeared. This is the story of a mother who lost her name, 2 sisters who lost their entire history, and the strangers who refused to let any of them stay forgotten. It is a story about how a person can vanish in plain sight, about the patience it takes to undo a silence that has lasted longer than the people in it have been alive, and about the strange, quiet miracle that can happen when someone simply refuses to stop asking a question. This channel exists for people exactly like them. The ones the world filed away. The ones whose stories went quiet because the answers were too hard to find. If you believe that no one deserves to be forgotten, that every missing person is still somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's child, then take a moment to subscribe and stay with me right to the end. Because what happened to this family is going to challenge almost everything you assume about how a person can simply disappear, and the way it was finally solved is something almost no one saw coming. Her name was Marina Ramos. She was 28 years old. And to understand what was taken from her, you first have to understand who she was before she became a case file, before she was a question with no answer, back when she was simply a young mother with a plan to start over. She was a young woman in her late 20s, raising 2 daughters in California in the closing years of the 1980s. She was not famous. She was not wealthy. She was the kind of person whose life leaves very little official trace, the kind of person whose existence is recorded mostly in the memories of the few people who loved her. She had family in the area. She had a cousin she trusted. And she had 2 little girls who depended on her completely. The oldest was Elizabeth. By that summer she was about 13 months old, just reaching the age where a baby becomes a toddler, where the first wobbling steps turn into real walking and the first sounds start turning into real words. She was at that brief, golden stage of life that parents always say goes by too fast. The youngest was Jasmin. She was only about 1 month old. A newborn. So new to the world that she had barely begun to exist in it. There was, at the time, only a single known photograph of Elizabeth, and no known photograph of Jasmin at all. Think about that for a moment. A baby so young when she vanished that there was not even a picture to remember her by. That detail alone would haunt the investigation decades later, and it would become one of the hardest obstacles the people trying to find her would ever face. Marina was their entire world, and they were hers. By every account, she was trying to do what so many young parents try to do. She was trying to build something better. She wanted a fresh start. And in the summer of 1989, she believed she had found a chance to make one. There is a small, human detail in the early part of this story that matters, because it tells you something about how ordinary her life was. For a short period that summer, Marina was not with her daughters. She had been away from them briefly, and during that time, her cousin, a woman named Esther, stepped in to care for the girls. This is the kind of thing families do for one another all the time. A relative is unavailable for a while, and another relative quietly takes over, feeding the baby, rocking the toddler to sleep, keeping the children safe until their mother can come back for them. Esther loved those little girls. She looked after them as if they were her own. And when the time came, she handed them back to their mother, the way she had always expected to. That handoff, that simple, loving exchange of two children from one trusted pair of arms to another, was one of the last completely innocent moments in this entire story. Because shortly after Marina collected her daughters, she told her family that she was leaving. She said she was heading to a town called Ontario, in California, to start a new life. She was not alone when she said it. She was with a man. The family knew very little about him. They knew him only by a single name. Fernando. That was it. No last name they could be sure of. No clear sense of where he had come from or how long Marina had known him. Just a first name, attached to a man who was about to drive away with a young mother and her two babies toward a brand new beginning in a brand new place. And then they were gone. For a while, no one panicked. Why would they? Marina had said she was moving. People move. People start over. People drift out of regular contact when they relocate to a new city with a new partner and the overwhelming demands of a toddler and a newborn. The silence that followed was not, at first, the silence of alarm. It was the ordinary silence of a young family settling into a new chapter somewhere out of sight. The people who loved her assumed she was busy. They assumed she was building the life she had described. They assumed, as we always do, that there would be more time, more visits, more phone calls down the road. There would not be. Because Marina never reached the new life she had described. And neither, in the way she had imagined, did her daughters. Now, here is a detail that will become important, a small thread that will run through this entire story like a crack running through glass. When Marina set out that summer, she was not using her own name. At some point she had begun going by another name entirely. To the records of the wider world, she was not Marina Ramos at all. She had become a woman called Maria Ortiz. A different name, stitched on top of her real one. On paper, that other woman had no obvious connection to the family Marina had left behind. It was a small thing. People use other names for all kinds of reasons, some of them dramatic, most of them mundane. But that single fact, the fact that she was living under a name that was not truly hers, would have consequences no one could possibly have predicted. It meant that when the worst happened, there would be nothing to tie the woman who was found to the woman who was missing. It meant that her own name would become the very thing that was lost. And it meant that the long road back to the truth would have to begin, decades later, with strangers trying to answer the most basic question a human being can be asked. Who are you? Hold on to that. Because the next time the world catches a glimpse of Marina, she will have no name at all. It was December of 1989. Several months had passed since that summer afternoon. Far from Bakersfield, far from Ontario, far from anywhere Marina had ever been known, in a remote part of Mohave County, Arizona, for travelers turned off Highway 93, out in the high desert near a place called White Hills, roughly 50 miles south of Las Vegas. The Arizona desert in winter is a vast, silent place. It is the kind of landscape that can hide almost anything, where a person can travel for miles without seeing another soul, where the wind erases footprints and the horizon swallows distance. It was here, off the side of that highway, that the four travelers came upon something they were never meant to see. They found the body of a young woman. She had been the victim of a terrible crime. The details are not the point of this story, and out of respect for her, and for the daughters who would one day learn what happened, I will not dwell on them. What matters is this. Investigators who responded to the scene believed she had not been there long. They believed she had lost her life only hours before she was found. Whatever had happened to her had happened close by, and recently. The desert had not had time to take her secrets yet. But the desert took something else. It took her name. Because when investigators searched the scene, they found no identification. Nothing in her possession could tell them who she was. There was no wallet, no document, no card, no clue. There was only a young woman, alone in the Arizona desert, with no way for anyone to say who she had been or where she had come from or who might be waiting for her to come home. So they did the only thing they could do. They gave her the name that investigators give to the unidentified dead. Jane Doe. It is one of the loneliest titles in the world. Jane Doe is not a name. It is the absence of a name. It is a placeholder, a temporary marker meant to hold a space until the real name can be found. Most of the time, in most cases, that name is found within days. Someone files a missing persons report. A family member calls. A match is made. The placeholder is replaced with a real identity, and the person is restored to the people who loved them. But not this time. The investigators in Mohave County did everything that could be done with the tools of 1989. They documented the scene. They collected what evidence they could, including a sample of her DNA, which they entered into the National Criminal Database in the hope that it might one day answer back. They put out word to other agencies. They waited for someone, anyone, to report a young woman missing who fit her description. And here is where Marina's two great misfortunes collided in the cruelest possible way. She had been living under another name, so the people back home had no reason to connect a Jane Doe in Arizona to the cousin who had simply moved away to start a new life. And she had been found in a remote desert in another state entirely, hundreds of miles from anyone who had ever known her face. The woman who was found and the woman who was missing existed in two completely separate worlds, and there was no bridge between them. The days passed. Then the weeks. No DNA match came back. No report fit. No family called to claim her. The investigation, despite the best efforts of the people working it, slowly ran out of road. There were no witnesses who could say what had happened on that desert highway. There was no name to build a story around. There was no thread to pull. And so, as so many cases from that era did, this one went cold. But I need you to notice what was missing from that desert scene. Because it is the single most important detail in this entire story, and it is the thing that should have changed everything, and somehow did not. There were no children. The young woman in the desert had been a mother of two. A 13-month-old and a newborn. But when she was found, there was no sign that any child had ever been there. No second set of belongings. No indication that two little girls had been anywhere near that highway. The babies were simply not there. And because no one knew who the woman was, no one knew she had babies in the first place. No one knew to ask the question that would have mattered most. If this young mother is here, then where, in all the world, are her two daughters? That question would go unasked for 33 years. Think about how long that is. 33 years is more than a generation. In the time that this young woman lay unidentified, the world transformed itself completely. The technology of 1989 became the technology of a new century. The cassette tapes and pay phones of her era gave way to a world of instant information that she would not have recognized. Children who had not yet been born when she died grew up, finished school, started careers, had children of their own. Entire decades came and went. And through all of it, the young woman from the desert remained exactly what she had been on the day she was found. A blank space. A question. A Jane Doe. In Mohave County, her file did not vanish. It sat in storage, the way cold case files do, waiting. Detectives retired. New ones took their place. The case was inherited, passed down, occasionally pulled out and re-examined and then, for lack of anything new, returned to the shelf. This is the quiet reality of a cold case that most people never think about. It is not that anyone gives up. It is that there is, quite literally, nothing left to do. You cannot interview a witness who does not exist. You cannot run a name you do not have. You cannot search for a family you cannot find. The case does not close. It simply waits, frozen at the moment the trail went cold, for the day when the science might catch up to the silence. And while that young woman waited in a file in Arizona, with no name and no story, something else was happening. Something that no one connected to her at all. Something that, looking back, is almost unbearable to consider. Because the answer to the question no one was asking, the question of where the two little girls had gone, was not buried in the desert. It was not lost forever. The answer had actually surfaced, very briefly, in a completely different place, at almost exactly the same time. And then it had quietly slipped beneath the surface again, unnoticed, unconnected, and unrecognized, for the next 3.5 decades. I will come back to that. Because the way these two stories finally fit together is the heart of everything. But first, I want you to sit for a moment in the years of silence, the years when nobody knew anything, because those empty years are not an interruption in this story. They are the story. Picture it from the perspective of the family back in California. Esther, the cousin who had cared for the girls and handed them back to their mother, went on with her life believing, as everyone did, that Marina had moved away and started over. Years went by. There were no letters, no calls, no visits. But people lose touch. Families scatter. A relative who relocates to a new city with a new partner can fade from contact without anyone assuming the worst. The silence was painful, perhaps, and strange, but it was not, on its own, proof of anything. It was just absence. The ordinary, ambiguous absence of someone who has drifted out of reach. And there was no body to grieve, because no one knew the body existed. There was no funeral, because no one knew there had been a death. There was no search, because to search for someone you have to first believe they are missing, and as far as anyone knew, Marina was not missing at all. She was simply living her new life somewhere else, just as she had said she would. That is the particular cruelty of this kind of case. The people who would have moved heaven and earth to find Marina did not even know she was gone. The grief that should have come crashing down in 1989 was instead held in suspension for over 3 decades, waiting for a truth that had not yet been allowed to arrive. And somewhere out in that same silence were 2 little girls. Elizabeth and Jasmin. If they were alive, they were growing up. If they were alive, they were learning to walk and talk and read and ride bikes and lose teeth and celebrate birthdays. If they were alive, they were becoming people, with personalities and favorite foods and best friends and fears, all of it unfolding under names that were not the names their mother had given them, in a story that did not include her at all. And if you are still with me right now, if you have felt even a fraction of the weight of those 2 little girls growing up somewhere in the world while their mother lay nameless in a desert, then I want you to do one small thing. Somewhere in the comments below, type 3 words. I am still here. Type it for Elizabeth and for Jasmin, wherever they were in all those silent years. Type it as a reminder that even when the world forgets, even when the trail goes cold, even when decades pass without a single answer, someone out here is still paying attention, still refusing to look away. 3 words. I am still here. Let those girls, and every person who was ever filed away as a question, know that they were never truly alone. Because here is what makes this case so different from the ones that end in heartbreak. The silence, in this story, was not the end. It was just the longest pause in the world before an answer that no one expected. The break, when it finally came, did not come from a witness. It did not come from a confession, or a tip, or a deathbed letter, or any of the dramatic turns that people imagine cracking a cold case wide open. It came from something far quieter, and far more powerful. It came from a fingerprint, and from an investigator who decided that a 33-year-old silence had gone on long enough. In early 2022, a special investigations unit in Mohave County took another look at the case of the unidentified woman from the desert. The case had been cold for so long that almost everyone connected to the original investigation was gone. But cold cases have a way of finding the right person at the right time, and this one found an investigator named Lori Miller. Now, here is the thing about identifying the dead that most people do not realize. The young woman had been carefully documented when she was found, including her fingerprints. But back in 1989, the systems used to compare those prints were limited. They could only match a print against the records they happened to contain, in the ways they happened to be able to search. If the right record was not in the right database, or if the technology could not read the print clearly enough, the match simply would not happen. And for 33 years, it had not happened. But technology does not stand still. Over those 3 decades, the national systems for storing and comparing fingerprints had grown enormously more powerful. The databases had expanded. The matching technology had sharpened. Prints that were unreadable to a computer in 1989 could suddenly be read with clarity by the technology of the 2020s. So in February of 2022, Lori Miller did something deceptively simple. She took the young woman's fingerprints, and she submitted them again, this time to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, using the vastly more advanced technology now available. It was the kind of step that costs almost nothing to attempt and that, most of the time, leads nowhere. A long shot. A box to check. One more attempt to throw a question into the void and see if, this time, anything answered back. This time, something answered back. The system returned a match. After 33 years of silence, the prints belonged to a woman named Maria Ortiz, from Bakersfield, California. Those records showed that Maria Ortiz had been arrested for shoplifting on the 15th of June, 1989, only weeks before she vanished. It was that small, ordinary brush with the law, a minor arrest, a set of fingerprints taken and stored and forgotten, that now, more than 30 years later, became the single thread that pulled the woman in the desert back from anonymity. But Maria Ortiz, of course, was the name on top of the name. The arrest paperwork listed 2 people she had been living with at the time. Detectives tracked one of them down and asked her about a woman called Maria Ortiz. The woman said she had never heard of anyone by that name. But then she said something else. She said that her cousin, a woman named Marina Ramos, had been missing since 1989. And there it was. The bridge between the 2 worlds. The woman in the desert and the cousin who had driven away to start a new life were, at last, revealed to be the same person. The placeholder fell away. Jane Doe became Marina Ramos. A daughter. A cousin. A young woman who had once been alive, with a face and a history and people who had loved her. But Lori Miller's discovery did not bring peace. It brought a brand new shock that no one was prepared for. Because when investigators finally sat down with Marina's family, when they delivered the long-delayed news that she was gone, the family asked a question that, in Miller's own words, completely blew the investigators away. Marina had 2 baby girls. Where were they? The investigators had spent their energy trying to identify a single unidentified woman. They had no idea, none whatsoever, that solving the mystery of who she was would instantly create a second mystery, far more urgent and far more haunting. A 13-month-old named Elizabeth and a 1-month-old named Jasmin. 2 children who had last been seen with their mother in the summer of 1989. 2 children who had not been in the desert with her. 2 children who had simply, completely, vanished from the record of the world. And now the question that should have been asked in 1989 finally landed, more than 3 decades too late. If Marina was here, then where were her daughters? They would be adults now. If they were alive, Elizabeth would be in her late 30s and Jasmin just behind her. 2 grown women somewhere in the world, who may have no memory of their mother at all, who may not even know they had ever had another name, who may be walking through their ordinary lives completely unaware that they had once been at the center of a tragedy. Or, just as possibly, 2 women whose fate had simply never been recorded. The murder of a mother had quietly become the search for 2 missing children, 3 decades after they were last seen. And the people leading that search had almost nothing to work with. They had a mother who was deceased. They had 2 children who had vanished as infants. They had no recent photographs, no last known address, no names the girls might be living under, and a trail that had gone cold before either of them had learned to walk. Lori Miller would later say that this had become the one case of her career, the one that every investigator carries. And through all of it, she held on to a single belief. She did not believe the girls had been harmed. She believed, against the odds, that they were alive somewhere, and that someone out there knew something. She said it haunted her. She made a public plea, the kind that cold case investigators make when they have exhausted every other option, asking anyone with information, and even anyone who suspected they themselves might be one of the missing girls, to come forward. In 2023, investigators began doing the only thing they could do. They began telling the story. They put out press releases. They turned to the media and to social platforms. They asked the public to help them find 2 women who had been missing since they were babies. They were casting a line into an ocean of people, hoping that somewhere out there, the right person would see it. But how do you search for someone when you do not even know what they look like? The girls had been infants when they disappeared. Elizabeth existed in just 1 known photograph. Jasmin existed in none. You cannot put a baby's face on a missing poster and expect anyone to recognize a grown woman of 36. The faces investigators needed did not exist. They had to be imagined. This is where one of the most extraordinary tools in modern missing persons work entered the story. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children took on the case, and their forensic artists set out to do something almost impossible. Using the single photograph of Elizabeth, using a photograph of Marina herself, and using everything that science understands about how a child's face matures into an adult's, they created age progression images. They built, from almost nothing, a vision of what these 2 women might look like today, more than 3 decades after they were last seen. Because they had so little to work from, both images had to be based on that one surviving photo of Elizabeth, which meant the 2 faces came out looking nearly identical, the way you might imagine 2 sisters could look. It was the best the science could do, and investigators hoped it would be enough to spark a single flicker of recognition in someone, somewhere. In the late summer of 2025, the images were released to the public. For the first time ever, the world had a face to look for. 2 faces. 2 grown women, conjured from memory and science and hope, ages 37 and 36, staring out of an image that asked a single desperate question. Have you seen us? Do you know who we are? Could one of these women be you? The images went out into the world. And what happened next happened with a speed that no one could have predicted. Because at the very same time those age progression images were being prepared, investigators had been pursuing another path, one far more powerful than any drawing. They had turned to the science that has, in recent years, rewritten the endings of cold cases that everyone had given up on. Forensic genetic genealogy. Let me explain what that means, because it is genuinely one of the most remarkable developments in the history of solving these cases. Traditional DNA matching works by comparing one person's genetic profile directly to another's. It is powerful, but it has a limit. You can only match a sample to a person who is already in a law enforcement database. If your missing person is not in the system, traditional DNA gives you nothing. That is exactly why the DNA collected from the desert back in 1989 had sat for decades without ever producing an answer. Forensic genetic genealogy breaks past that limit completely. Instead of looking only for an exact match, it looks for relatives. It takes a genetic profile and compares it against the enormous, ever-growing pools of DNA that ordinary people have voluntarily submitted to consumer ancestry and genealogy services. It does not need to find the exact person. It only needs to find a cousin, an aunt, a distant relative, anyone who shares enough DNA to be on the same family tree. And once you find even a single relative, skilled genealogists can begin building outward, branch by branch, name by name, narrowing an entire family tree down until it points to one specific person. And here, in this case, is a detail that I find almost too poignant to say out loud. The reason it worked, the reason the family tree could be built at all, is that one of the missing girls had quietly done something years earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with any investigation. The younger of the two sisters had always wondered about where she really came from. She had grown up carrying that question, the way adopted children so often do. And so, at some point, simply trying to understand her own origins, she had uploaded her own DNA to a genealogy website. She had no idea she was a missing person. She had no idea her mother had a name in a cold case file in Arizona. She was just a woman looking for her own roots. And in doing so, without ever knowing it, she had left behind the exact piece of the puzzle that investigators would one day need to find her. She had, in a sense, helped solve her own disappearance. On the 27th of August, 2025, just weeks after the age progression images were released, the work paid off. Investigators located a woman whose DNA showed a strong connection to the Ramos family. A forensic genetic genealogist analyzed the connection and concluded that this woman was very likely one of the two missing girls. But the most powerful confirmation did not come from a database. It came from the woman herself. Because when investigators carefully reached out to her, when they began, gently, to explain who they were and what they were looking for, she told them something that nobody had to coax out of her. She told them that she and her sister had been abandoned in a park, in December of 1989. And there it was. The answer to the question no one had been able to ask for 33 years. The reason there had been no children in the desert. The reason two little girls had simply vanished from the world. Because they had not vanished at all. They had been found. Not in Arizona, but back in California, in a city called Oxnard, which sits on the coast between Santa Barbara and Los Angeles, roughly 400 miles from the desert where their mother was found. And here is the detail that I have been holding back, the detail that turns this entire tragedy into something else, something almost beyond belief. In December of 1989, witnesses near a place called Colonia Park in Oxnard noticed something. A woman and two men had gotten out of a black mini pickup truck somewhere in the neighborhood beside the park. One witness would later describe the woman in striking, specific detail. She wore a long red skirt and white boots. And she was carrying the smaller of two little girls, the youngest one, wrapped in a yellow blanket. The witness watched them for a moment, the woman, the two men, the toddler, the baby in the yellow blanket, and then, in the ordinary distraction of an ordinary day, lost track of them. A short time later, a person walking near that same park heard the sound of children crying. The crying was coming from a restroom. The passerby asked a nearby woman to go and check. And when she went inside, she found them. Two tiny girls. A toddler and an infant. Alone. No adult anywhere in sight. Just two little children, far too young to say their own names, far too young to explain how they had gotten there or who had left them, found cold and frightened and entirely on their own. For 33 years, investigators in Arizona had searched for an answer in the desert. And for that entire time, the answer had been sitting in a completely separate file, in a completely different state, in the records of a local case from 1989. Two abandoned babies, found safe. But because no one knew who the babies were, and because no one knew who the woman in the desert was, and because the two cases existed in two separate worlds with no thread between them, the connection was never made. The babies who were found and the mother who was lost were never placed in the same story until genetic science finally drew the line between them, more than 3 decades later. And when investigators finally laid the two timelines side by side, they saw something that settled one terrible question forever. Marina had been found in the Arizona desert on the 12th of December. Her daughters had been left at that park in Oxnard on the 14th of December. 2 days later. Which meant Marina was already gone before her children were ever abandoned. As the investigator put it plainly, there was simply no way Marina could have left her own daughters in that restroom. She was not the one who walked away from them. Someone else did. Someone else carried those two little girls 400 miles, left them on a cold floor, and disappeared. And that is why the people seen with the children that day, the woman in the long red skirt and white boots, and the two men from the black pickup, are exactly the people investigators believe may hold the answer to what happened to Marina. The lead investigator has said she strongly believes those three were connected, in one way or another, to Marina's death. But the little girls themselves were safe. They had been taken into protective custody. And then something happened that, in the middle of all this sorrow, is genuinely a mercy. They were not separated. They were adopted together, by a couple in California, and they grew up side by side. Through all those silent years, through all the time their mother lay nameless and their birth family did not even know to grieve, the two sisters had at least had each other. They had grown up together. They had never been alone in the way that everyone feared. On the 22nd of September, 2025, the final DNA confirmation came back. It was certain. The two women were, beyond doubt, the missing daughters of Marina Ramos. The toddler who had once been about 13 months old was Elizabeth. The newborn who had been only a month old, the baby with no photograph, the baby once wrapped in a yellow blanket, was Jasmin. 36 years after they were last seen as their mother's children, Elizabeth and Jasmin Ramos had their full names, and their full story, restored to them. They had been living in California the entire time. Their whole lives. They had learned, as teenagers, that they were adopted, but they had never known the truth of where they truly came from. They had grown into women with lives and families of their own, now living in different states, still close as sisters, still carrying the quiet question that neither of them had ever been able to answer, until a 33-year-old fingerprint and a voluntary DNA test finally answered it for them. I want to let that settle, because it is a strange and overwhelming kind of resolution. This is not a story where two missing people were found in danger and rescued. The sisters were never in danger. By the time the world went looking for them, they were grown women, safe, raised, living ordinary lives. The tragedy was not that they were lost in the present. The tragedy was that they had been disconnected from their own past so completely that they did not even know it was missing. They did not know their mother's name. They did not know how they had come to be abandoned in that park. They did not know there was a family out in the world that had loved their mother, or that their mother had once held them and dreamed of a fresh start. Their history had been amputated from them when they were too young to remember, and they had simply grown up without it, the way you grow up without something you never knew you were supposed to have. And there was even more family waiting than they realized. Because as investigators worked with the Ramos relatives, they discovered that Marina had not had 2 daughters, but 3. There was an older sister, a third girl, who had been raised by her grandparents and had grown up apart from the 2 who were taken. So the reunion that began with a fingerprint did not just give Elizabeth and Jasmin back their mother's name. It gave them an older sister they had never met, and an extended family that had been carrying its own version of this grief for decades. And on the other side of that same tragedy stands Marina herself. Because there is a grief in this story that no breakthrough can fix. Marina did not live to see her daughters grow up. She did not live to see them found. The reunion that genetic science finally made possible came 36 years too late for the one person who wanted it most. Her daughters got their mother's name back. But they got it back as history, not as a person they could call. The breakthrough gave them their origin. It could not give them their mother. And it is here that we arrive at the question this case leaves wide open, the part of the story that is not finished, and may never be. Because finding Elizabeth and Jasmin answered the question of where the children went. It did not answer the question of what happened to their mother. Marina's death remains unsolved. There are the 3 people seen with the babies at the park, the woman in the red skirt and white boots and the 2 men from the black pickup, whom the lead investigator believes were connected to the case. And then there is the separate, older thread, the man Marina drove away with in the summer of 1989, the man her family knew only as Fernando. After Marina was finally identified, her cousin Esther worked with an artist to create a sketch of the man she remembered, in the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize him. Investigators have made clear that they want to find him, that they want to talk to him, that he is someone they need to understand in order to understand what happened. But I want to be very careful and very fair here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where stories like this go wrong. To say that investigators want to speak with someone is not to say that person is guilty of anything. A sketch is a question, not an accusation. The man called Fernando may hold the missing piece of this puzzle, or he may simply be one more thread that leads somewhere unexpected. What is confirmed is this. A young mother lost her life in the Arizona desert in 1989. Her daughters were carried 400 miles and left safe in a California park 2 days later, and raised under new names. Decades later, science reunited their identities with their history. And the question of who was responsible for Marina's death is still open. It is still out there. Someone, somewhere, may still know the answer. That is the part of this story that has not been written yet. And it is the reason cases like this one are never truly closed. I want to tell you the detail from all of this that stays with me the most, because it is not the science, and it is not the timeline. It is the yellow blanket. Think about everything that was lost in this case. A whole name, erased for 33 years. 2 faces, gone so completely that artists had to invent them. An entire childhood, separated from the people it belonged to. And yet, across all of that loss, one stranger near a park in 1989 held on to a single small thing for 36 years. The color of a baby's blanket. That is the kind of detail that no one makes up. It is too specific, too ordinary, too human. It is proof that a real person really stood there, on a real day, and watched a real baby being carried past, and that the smallest, gentlest object in this entire terrible story, a blanket meant to keep an infant warm, is also one of the truest pieces of evidence we have that any of it happened at all. Sometimes the things that survive are not the big things. Sometimes what survives is the color of a blanket, and the memory of one person who simply did not forget. So what do we take from all of this? What is the lesson hidden inside 36 years of silence? I think it is this. We live in a world that moves on quickly. A story stays in the news for a day, a week, and then it is gone, replaced by the next thing and the thing after that. The people behind those stories do not disappear when the headlines do. They are still out there. Still missing. Still unidentified. Still waiting in a file on a shelf for the day the science catches up, or for the day the right person decides to look one more time. Marina waited 33 years for someone to take her fingerprints and try again. Her daughters waited 36 years to learn where they came from. And the only reason any of it was ever resolved is that people refused to accept the silence as final. An investigator who decided a long shot was worth taking, and who carried the case like it was her own. Forensic scientists who built faces out of almost nothing and family trees out of strangers' DNA. A young woman who, just by wanting to know herself, left behind the very clue that brought her home. And a family that, the moment they learned the truth, opened their arms to the daughters they had never known. None of them gave up. And because they did not give up, a woman who had been a blank space for 3 decades became a person again, and 2 women who had grown up without a history finally had one. There are wounds that no reunion can fully heal. There are years that no science can give back. Elizabeth and Jasmin will never get to meet the mother whose name they now carry. Marina will never get to see the women her babies became. That part of the story is simply, permanently sad, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But alongside that sorrow is something genuinely hopeful. The truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, no matter how many names are layered on top of it, no matter how many years pass, can still rise to the surface. It can still find its way home. Sometimes all it needs is a single person willing to ask the question one more time. That is why this work matters. That is why these stories deserve to be told carefully, accurately, and with respect for the real people inside them. Not as entertainment, but as a record. A way of saying that these lives counted. That this mother counted. That 2 little girls left crying in a restroom in 1989 counted, and grew up, and are owed the dignity of their own true history. If this story moved you, if you believe that no person should ever spend decades as a question mark, then there are a few simple things you can do, and they genuinely matter more than you might think. Take a moment to like this video, because every like helps it reach more people, and in a case like this one, reach is the very thing that brought 2 sisters home. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because this community of people who care is part of what keeps these stories alive long after the news has moved on. And if you have not already, subscribe and follow along, because there are countless others still waiting in the silence, still unnamed, still unfound, and every one of them deserves the same patience, the same persistence, and the same refusal to look away that finally gave the Ramos family their answer. Thank you, sincerely, for staying with me to the end of this one. The fact that you are still here, that you cared enough about 2 strangers to listen to their whole story, is exactly the kind of attention that solves cases the world had given up on. Somewhere out there, another truth is waiting for someone to ask the right question one more time. Until next time, take care of the people around you, hold on to the names and the faces and the small things that matter, and never assume that just because a story has gone quiet, it is over. Sometimes the answer is only a single question away.